Hey guys, Cam McClellan.
Al Lewison.
Welcome to today's Wealth Quad. Workout of the day. Been a lot of talk in my newsletter the other week about negative gearing and the impact negative gearing would have to housing in Australia and investors if it was removed, because that's the talk about from a few economists that perhaps that could be a solution to our increasing house pricing and the affordability.
So we're not tax guys, we're not economists, we're not accountants.
No.
But we'll give you our thoughts and we'll sort of just brainstorm it and work through it.
So obviously being investors, negative gearing, when I buy a property I take advantage of depreciation and that until 3 to 5 years later that property becomes positive and carries itself. I like negative gearing, it's fantastic. I buy good growth properties that will double in value. So let's talk through negative gearing and what happens in our mind. Once again, not economists, not accountants, not brokers, not politicians. We're investors, so it's important to us. That's the reality. Yep. They did remove negative gearing back in, was it the Hawke era? And I think it was the fastest turnaround of any policy change that I've ever seen. So negative gearing was flipped around really fast and put back in.
There's a couple of other things in my opinion in the economy at the moment. So the property sector and the housing sector are all very strong. But you're reading the papers saying they're talking about dropping interest rates because the economy is in the doldrums. Well, what they've got there is one sector that is actually helping to drive things along. Now, I guess
it's the biggest sector. The biggest driver of our economy is the building industry.
We've also got the government saying things like, now that the mining boom is becoming into its construction phase, into its
delivery phase.
The construction work has declined, but now the exports ramp up, which brings money in, but all these construction jobs are no longer there. So they're talking about trying to find ways to put these workers into jobs. So everything they're saying about negative gearing contradicts those two things. So negative gearing, what it will do is dramatically decrease the number of investors in the market in the short term.
Yeah, and hence slow the building industry. So the building industry will slow down. Now the building industry, obviously being the biggest driver, bigger than mining, of the economy, whichever government brings it in is not going to be seen very favourable because the economy is going to take a dive. Now that might happen for a while. So once again, we take into account and go, I don't think it will happen, but if it does, what happens? So they talk about negative gearing remaining for people who have property, and any new people, and this is probably an important thing to take into account, any new people may not take advantage of negative gearing. So let's think about it. So you've got a massive decrease, 30% of properties purchased are by investors, thereabouts. So, it's about 40.7% at the moment. So that's going to decrease a considerable amount.
Yep.
We've got a huge undersupply of affordable housing in Australia. So the government is already about double each year short on the required housing that's getting built each year. So they've lost all that and they rely on investors to uplift that. So what happens? And this is the reason a lot of American economists talk about our property prices being too high or inflated. And one of the biggest things they take into account is the difference between rental yield and property prices. And they say there's a huge difference in that. The reason there's a difference is because the government, what negative gearing is designed to do is to subsidise investors to provide, a lower rental price. So we don't have areas like in the States where they have affordable housing, where you have those medium and low rise and high rise ghettos.
Rent control buildings,
and that's what America have. They don't have negative gearing. They build these ghettos which are rent controlled. Instead, in Australia, the government provides negative gearing to subsidise investors so that investors are able to provide cheap rent. Therefore, people can live in housing in Australia across the board in good community. So that's really what negative gearing does. So, all right. So let's say negative gearing is knocked out. The investors come out of the market. What happens over the next 12 months? I know what I'll be doing with my rent prices. I will jack my rent prices so hard because I'm going to have a line of people waiting up to try and get my property because no new properties are getting built into the market. So over about a 12-month, 24-month period, rents are going to rise to a point where it becomes feasible to start investing again. That's about the crux of it. So the government for a 2-year period is going to get belted around for ruining the economy, and then rent prices will come up. and me as an investor, I'll come in and start buying property again.
Another thing you hear, the government, or not the government, but you hear these American experts come in and say, well, our property market dropped, and here's how our property market works, and here's why your property market should drop, and house growth's not sustainable, and negative gearing's causing it.
I reckon we've got about 30 seconds.
All right. Well, I had an interesting stat recently, which is that Australia is one of 3 countries in the world where 60% of the population live in cities with more than 1 million people. And when there's a city with more than 1 million people, guess what? Property prices are driven up by people wanting to live closer to employment opportunities.
Supply and demand, baby.
Supply and demand.
Hopefully that gives you an insight on what we're thinking about negative gearing, guys.